Well, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started. And welcome to the second open house for the Boone County Master Plan. My name's Stephen Ivendall, principal of the I-5 group, and also project manager of our planning team. Really excited that everyone could join us this evening. I know there's many ways to spend your Wednesday evening, and we're glad you're spending it with us, talking about the future of Boone County. So we'll just jump right in. We have a lot to cover tonight. Um, our agenda for tonight, really kind of four main things we want to talk about. Give you an update on growth projections for the county. Spend some time talking about precedent counties in terms of maybe lessons learned, and then also talk about potential growth scenarios for the county, and then evaluation for those growth scenarios. So I'll mention this now, and also later on, can we get to those sections too? As we think about growth in the county, often there's no right or wrong answer. It's all about evaluating choices, making logical decisions. And as we kind of ask for input about the scenarios, it's not necessarily a American Idol style voting. It's more about providing feedback and perhaps blending of the scenarios as we move forward in the planning process. We've got a great planning team working with us on this plan, and you'll meet many of those later on in the presentation, and they'll introduce themselves as we move through their sections later on in the presentation. So I apologize, maybe in advance you'll get a lot of me, especially early on in the presentation. We're also working with a couple of really great committees. We have two committees, advisory committee and a technical committee. Our technical committee, as the name implies, a little bit more technical focused, representatives from different utilities, MoDOT, et cetera. Our advisory committee, made up of members of Planning and Zoning Commission, different communities, businesses and organizations in the county, really working with us. That committee is working with us as a sounding board for the planning team as we move through the process. And more information about both the committees and the planning team can be found on the website. But just a little housekeeping for tonight. As we move through the process, we have a lot to cover, probably a good 90 minutes in terms of a presentation. So if you have questions, we're asking that you save those until the end. If you're interested at the end of the presentation, asking a question, put your name at the chat. We'll unmute you at the end, and then say your name, ask your question. We'll kind of go over this again at the end. We also realized too tonight we have a lot of information for you to digest. This presentation, both the video and a PDF of the presentation, will be available on the website later this week. So if you want to catch up, with the information and then kind of give us more feedback later, we'll be doing a series of listening sessions in the county later in April. So Tuesday, April 23rd, will be in 3 locations: Harrisburg, Centralia, and then Columbia. And then Wednesday, the 24th, during the day in Columbia, then late afternoon at Ashland City Hall. And again, this information and a chance to sign up for those listening sessions will be available on the website later this week. And again, if you have questions, you put things in the chat, and as we go, again, we'll kind of save those to the end, and then we'll kind of ask you to unmute to ask those questions live. So where we are in the planning process. So we're at the stage we're kind of calling phase 2, growth analysis and scenario planning. We'll take the work we hear both from tonight and then what we hear at the listening sessions, and we'll use it to help then shape the draft master plan that we'll be working on this spring and summer. And then we hope to complete this process in the fall. So why update the master plan? I think we've talked about this if you came to our first open house last fall. Three main reasons. One, the current plan is over 25 years old. The county has grown a lot in the last 20 years, expected to grow more in the future. So really, the plan becomes a logical land use decision making in terms of a guide for rezoning requests, other land use decisions. It also becomes a strategic guide for future growth and change. So even though a lot of the plan is focused on land use and transportation, we're also examining different trends and demographics, jobs, housing, et cetera. And so we're sharing that with our committees. We're sharing that with some of the different partners the counties work with. And it's also a chance to have some discussion as a countywide community in terms of developing some countywide priorities and a countywide vision, especially as it pertains to growth. And then a little background in terms of what is a master plan and what is especially a future land use plan. In many ways, the future land use plan is really the core component of the master plan. And on the left there, you see, as I mentioned, the current master plan for the county is over 25 years old. It can be close to 30 years old. Last done in 1996, and you see the future land use plan there on the left. Safe to say, fairly dated. On the right, I'll be talking about our precedent counties later on. You kind of see the future land use plan, kind of a more modern future land use plan there on the right. And this jurisdiction for the plan is the unincorporated areas of Boone County. So as I mentioned on our committees, we have representatives from the communities, representatives from throughout the county, because it's important as we think about unincorporated areas of the county. Obviously, the communities impact those; they're growing, et cetera. So even though the jurisdiction for this plan is for the unincorporated areas, we're including essentially the whole county as kind of part of the planning process. One other aspect in terms of the master plan, in many ways, it's a policy document. Sometimes I also like to use the analogy of a strategic plan. So a lot of times, if your organization or business or school has gone through a strategic planning process, there's a lot of similarities to that in terms of a master plan or a comprehensive plan. It's really a guide. It's really a policy document that really then informs other aspects. So on one side, it kind of on the boxes there underneath, it informs regulatory tools. So as in terms of zoning, subdivision, and development regulations, the master plan as a policy document helps inform those. It also helps inform more detailed plans. And the list you see there, a lot of those things are already being done, if not by Boone County, by maybe other partners in the county, in terms of things like transportation. The county and Columbia and other partners have just kicked off a more detailed housing study. So a lot of times, some more detailed elements of topics that we cover in the master plan are dealt with in more detail by other plans. And then in terms of education, again, a lot of actions as you start to implement the plan can be done through voluntary action, where the plan can be an educational component in terms of education, advocacy, et cetera. And then a chance in terms of then help to guide partnering. The county is always coordinating with different communities, different agencies, different utilities. So the master plan is a chance to communicate with those different kind of partner organizations in terms of current trends, and then again current thinking, especially in terms of land use and transportation. What we've heard to date, as I mentioned, we're kind of in the second phase of the process. Last year, if you've been following the process, we spent a lot of time with community engagement in terms of listening. We did a countywide survey late summer, early fall. We've been looking at existing conditions and existing trends, and all that was packaged up in what we call the discovery report that was issued over the winter. If you haven't seen a copy of that, it can be downloaded at the ourboone.com website. So just we heard a lot of good feedback through the engagement last year, and probably really kind of three things that really kind of stood out both in the engagement and the data. One, is Boone County at a tipping point in terms of growth? In a lot of ways, probably yes. We heard a lot about in terms of the strengths of the county, in terms of why people love living in Boone County. Why people love living in Boone County is the beauty of Boone County, the rural character, et cetera. But then we heard concerns about things like urban sprawl. And in a lot of ways, the county hasn't sprawled to date, kind of based on some of the data. One kind of definition is that if you've had more developed area growth in terms of population growth, that's sprawl. But to date, the county's grown pretty smartly. That you've had more population growth than you've had growth in development area. Now is that changing? We'll look at some of the data later on, but to date you've grown pretty smartly. There was also a lot of consensus as we did the survey in terms of balanced growth. We had enough survey responses that we were able to break those down by unincorporated residents, residents from smaller towns, Ashland, Centralia, Hallsville, Surgeon, et cetera, and then Columbia residents. And through all three categories, there was a lot of consensus about the need for balanced growth. There was some disagreement about what that looks like, and that's kind of why this is an important part of the process. But a lot of consensus about the need for balanced growth. And then also the fact that obviously Boone County is a big county. Needs and priorities vary in different parts of the county. So especially as we sort of get into the draft plan itself in terms of writing and illustrating that, keeping that in mind. As a planning team, we need to keep in mind that sometimes, in terms of the data, if we look at job growth, population growth, things tend to center around Columbia. So it's important as a planning team to keep that larger focus in mind. So to kind of summarize it, also some key issues that we've heard, and you'll hear later on in the presentation. We've also kind of used these key issues as a basis for evaluating different ways to grow in terms of criteria evaluation. I won't read these. You can see them on your screen, but really kind of 6 categories, and in a lot of ways we're calling them these kind of key issues and evaluation criteria now. But in a lot of ways, you could also maybe sort of look at these as kind of core values of the county in terms of goals and principles of the plan as we move forward. So we'll touch on more on these later in the presentation. The one thing I will kind of touch on now will be housing. You see that kind of housing is only one bullet point. Obviously, housing is a hugely important topic for the county, and as we'll talk about later, housing and how we accommodate housing in the future is a huge driver of land use. We've also heard, again, from all segments of the population about the importance of options for housing and affordable housing for various segments of the population, whether it's a young family or new professionals or singles or seniors, et cetera. Just that need for affordable housing options in the county. From the master plan, knowing that again the county and other partners are working on a more detailed housing study, is a huge part of kind of the land use component. But we also want to be a little bit careful in terms of not stepping on the toes of some of the policy recommendations coming out of that kind of concurrent study with this overall master plan. So growth projection. I'm going to turn over to Bob Lewis here in a minute to kind of walk you through some of the different growth projections that we looked at for the county. But to kind of put things in perspective before I turn it over to Bob, so we've basically looked at kind of 2 projections of growth for the county. One is basically the county has grown tremendously over the last several decades. So we're looking at in terms of what we call more of the same. Will the recent growth rates continue the next coming decades? We don't think it'll grow faster. And then projection 2 that we've looked at is what we call Americana. Will growth rates more closely align with national trends, which actually would be slower than what Boone County has grown to date. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob and have him kind of walk you through the growth projections.
Stephen, you're in charge of slide changes, right?
I am.
All right. Well, then you can go to the next slide. So, looking at the Americana part in particular, it's good to kind of review the history of population growth rate changes in the United States as a whole. Since the first census in 1790, this graph shows those census numbers. Every 10 years we do the census. And what we're seeing of recent vintage, but kind of long-term trend, is that the growth rates, that is, the rate of adding more people to the United States, have been going down. It's still growing, and we've been growing a lot. We're around 350 million people in the United States today. But looking at the curve since 2000 in particular, and then certainly beyond 2024, and Census Bureau's own projections of the United States rate of growth into the year 2100, if you look closely, you'll see we're going to get some negative growth rates there in late part of the century. I'm probably going to start contributing to that as a baby boomer. I don't think I'm going to last that long, but it'd be kind of cool if I did. So when we're dealing with the Americana projections, we're dealing with a smaller piece of pie. Next slide will show the effects of those two scenarios that Stephen just talked about. If Boone County continues to grow as it has the last 2 decades, 2000 to 2022, it keeps on going out to 2050, you get kind of a straight line. And we'll have a county that has 252,000 people in it, or if you look over to the right, about 68,000 more people than today. But if given the slowdown of the United States growth, and Boone County continues to get a fair share of that, we'd likely see a slowdown in the growth rate of population in Boone County, and fewer net new residents, totaling in the order of 36,000 more residents, up to about 220,000 there in 2050. The real line's probably in between somewhere. We don't expect, Boone County has already bucked the growth rate of the United States for a while, so it's a good chance it continue to. It's a great county. It's got a lot of amenities, great highway system, transportation system to get you here and there in the middle of a big state. So chances are it's going to grow pretty healthy over the next 25, 30 years. But can it keep up what we've been doing? That's why we're giving us all a range to work with here. Next slide. Now, combined with that, people have to live somewhere, and trend lines in the United States and even in Missouri and Boone County, generally speaking, have been smaller household sizes. That is, numbers of people that live in an occupied housing unit. So looking at this graphic, again, gives us a bit of a range. That red line takes the long-term trends and continues them downward. It's probably not going to be that severe to have to go down to around 2.17 persons per household on average, but not out of belief. Shorter term range, if you look at a nearer term range like we did for the more of the same scenario on populations, more likely we'll have average household sizes a bit larger, even though declining over the next 25 years. Next slide. That has implications on both of those population scenarios. Each one of them can have the high or low population per household numbers applied to them, and that gives us 2 ranges for each of the for housing needs for each of the population ranges there. So if we have a lot more population growth with relatively small household sizes, we're going to need more housing units to occupy to accommodate all of those all that population. On the other side, on the other hand, if you have slow population growth with high population per household, you need fewer housing units to accommodate it, and points in between. So that's giving us what we've got here. So under those scenarios, we could see between 101,500 to 128,000 housing units in Boone County in 2050, or an increase of, as you can look, if you combine the numbers on the right there, anywhere between about 21,700 more units to as many as 48,000 or more additional net housing units. Some of them we're going to lose anyway. We'll have to build a lot of housing units. Now, that said, we'll move to the next slide. We can look at, and we're going to talk about land needs for that housing a little bit later. We'll shift quickly to some population or some projections out to 2050 on jobs or the economy expressed through number of jobs. Again, if jobs grow, as we're showing it will happen, should happen, we're going to need land for places for all of these net new workers, let alone the old workers, to work. We're going to build new buildings, industries, offices, commercial centers, and so forth. So we have implications for land use needs from not only housing, but certainly growth in the economy. And we're not going to get housing growth without economic growth and vice versa. But again, more of the same. We could expect 178,000 jobs in the county in 2050, that range, about 40,000 more than we have today. During the Americana, more of the Americana range, like we did for housing, much smaller. We'll have a lot slower growth in job creation, job additions within the county, even though we'll have some population growth as well. But then the state of Missouri is very nice and provides us some projections independent of our work for the central region of Missouri, of which Boone County is, well, a central part. As can you imagine that, right in the middle of the state? And a bit more aggressive than the Americana, but less aggressive than more of the same. So you begin to see a range here between as few as 1,500 net new jobs to as many as 40,000. Perhaps it's more in that 23,000, 24,000 net new jobs range. But again, that requires land to occupy them. Then you look at projections of the kinds of jobs that we're likely to see. If you look over to the left, you get a quick idea that education's important in Boone County. I'm shocked. And healthcare and related things as well. Where there's a bit of a weakness, frankly, in Boone County is in the professional, scientific, and tech services field, despite all the well-educated people we're pushing out of the universities in Columbia. But that's going to grow nationwide, statewide, and region-wise. So we're expecting that growth in jobs will be heavily weighted towards more brain power, skill power, and health power. It's just the picture you're sort of getting to the right as well. That'll have multiplier effects, of course, for the need for building things. So you need specially trained contractors and so forth, as well as all that admin and support services as well. But we should be seeing more of that brain power and health power growth in Boone County, given the job projections numbers that we have. Next. And I think that's back to Stephen.
Thanks, Bob. Next section, we want to talk a little bit about precedent counties. I think especially since it's been a while since Boone County's had an updated master plan, we felt it was important to really look at other precedent counties in terms of lessons learned, in terms of how they've dealt with growth in their counties, what have they've incorporated in their master plans as key elements, key policies. Just especially as a planning team, as we're working with the committees, as we sort of move forward into recommendations, we're pulling things from things that are being used, elsewhere. So as I want to walk you through the precedent counties that we've chosen, and then we kind of get to the end. I'll also say too we've got 5 precedent counties that we're looking at. If you're interested in kind of looking for yourself, to go to Our Document section of the ourboone.com website. We've got the 5 precedent counties and their master plans in that section of the website. So we started with a little bit longer list of about 15 or 16 long list counties. We were looking at Midwestern counties. Wanted to find counties that had some similar population growth, similar population, similar land cover types, and also similar what we call typology. We consider Boone County more of a city center. You've got Columbia, and then kind of the surrounding, rural, small towns around it. So kind of a city center as opposed to what we call maybe metropolitan fringe. That you think about like maybe like St. Charles County near St. Louis, counties all along kind of a bigger metro fringe. So then out of those 15 or 16 longer lists, we've picked 5 counties to do a deeper dive on. And so these 5, not only are they city center, but they also have a university as part of their components. And then we've started going in and doing research in those precedent counties in terms of starting with a higher level in terms of just what are the key goals and key issues of these various plans. And just I want to spend a little time on this slide in terms of kind of walking you through and starting with kind of the first 2 lines there in terms of joint city and county plans. It's interesting, as I mentioned, Boone County, our areas for the unincorporated areas jurisdiction. And typically that's how a master plan kind of follows. Douglas County, where Lawrence is in Kansas, is really kind of a joint city and county plan. So they were very very purposeful in doing a joint plan. So Boone, we're incorporating the different communities as part of the planning process. I think Douglas County kind of went a step further and really kind of further tied that integration of city and county planning. Kind of also note in terms of Kalamazoo, Michigan, one of the precedent counties. This may be because of state enabling legislation. Again, kind of how states guidelines for counties and cities to plan sometimes dictates how things are done. But Kalamazoo is interesting, where each of the cities and each of the townships actually do their own planning effort, kind of mini plans, if you will, and then the county plan is a summary of those. Kind of in the next line, all the plans, a little bit less with Kalamazoo, so we didn't include that one for this one, but 4 of the 5 plans, in terms of a policy level, really use utilization of growth boundaries, growth tiers, and urbanizing areas as a way to start to think about and manage growth. And along with that, all 5 counties, really have policy goals in terms of promoting, encouraging. Some of the master plans kind of use different language of promoting urban infill and higher densities in or near existing cities. And then as you kind of get to the next lines there, these start to kind of really start to kind of overlap with some of the kind of key issues and some of the values and some of the potential goals that we've heard about from residents in Boone County in terms of things like being efficient with infrastructure and utilities. So all the counties in some form talk about the need to utilize existing utilities and infrastructure and grow the availability of adequate infrastructure. Also, all the master plans and all the counties kind of have that as policy. All 5 have a goal of preserving agricultural land. Although we made a note there on Monroe, Indiana, of the 5 counties, Monroe is probably a lease of agriculture being a focus in terms of part of the kind of county economy, more kind of a woodland type county. Preserve, conserve, or protect natural resources. Again, for all 5 counties, a key goal. 3 out of the 5 kind of went further in terms of talking about the rural character. Obviously, rural character, somewhat obviously subjective, but the importance of that. 4 of the 5 counties too, also in terms of housing, and again, I think all the master plans of the precedent counties, housing is an important topic from the land use perspective, but in terms of specific housing policy, usually kind of deferring it to a more specific, separate plan. Again, kind of making a note of Kalamazoo there in the spreadsheet. Kalamazoo was the only county, at least from a master plan level, talking about the importance and the need for more missing middle housing. I'm sorry, missing middle housing. Which in some ways, if you're kind of following the discussion of housing over the last several years, Missing middle housing it's that range of, a lot of communities will have, single family and then kind of jump to kind of larger, multifamily, apartment, condo complexes. That missing middle is those duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, which have been around in a lot of communities for a number of years. But there's been a period over the last maybe a couple decades where we've kind of lost that typology and kind of in the housing market. All the plans talk about multimodal, having multimodal transportation options. Then also, using the land use plan in terms of the importance of having developable sites in terms of growing the local economy. So I think in terms of, you look at these other precedent counties and what they've done with their planning efforts. There's a lot of overlap to the things we've heard from residents last year in terms of, again, some of the key issues that they want to see addressed. Your other Midwestern counties are doing the same thing. And then from a land use perspective, a couple kind of key slides tonight, and this is kind of one of the key slides that I kind of want to walk you through. That's a little busy, but I think there's some important information on this. And again, if you download this later, this may be something again to kind of come back and spend more time on. So what you see here at the top of the page is the 5 counties, and we've done a diagrammatic version of the county's future land use plans to kind of start to kind of break down those components. So to kind of walk you through kind of what these are and kind of what they mean and how they kind of relate then to our planning for Boone. I'll start kind of with the left with Douglas County, Kansas, and kind of talk about the different elements. So there's really kind of 3 kind of, I'll use the word kind of hierarchy to the land use plans that are really, again, consistent amongst the the different precedent counties, and even as we looked at the larger longer list of counties in terms of precedents, and this idea of looking at city areas, edges of the cities, and then kind of the remaining kind of rural areas of the county. So so for Lawrence, if you look at Lawrence kind of on the top left, the dark blue is the city, is the area of the city, and again the city has its own land use policy, has its own zoning, planning for growth. So as I mentioned, on the previous slide, all the master plans from the precedent counties had goals in terms of really trying to direct growth and infill into the cities. But then all the plans also have then the edge areas. Lawrence kind of had two edge areas. They had kind of the grayish area kind of immediately around the city that they called tier 2. So these were areas where utilities would be planned for and would be available for growth, typically with densities kind of matching densities of the existing city. And then kind of a third growth tier is kind of seeing the lighter blue a little bit further out, what they call growth tier 3. Again, a little bit more kind of saving for the future, if you will, kind of, instead of thinking about growth 10 or 20 years, think about growth, 30 plus years out. And then the remaining areas of the county, kind of really the lighter blue, as the rural area. And in this case, from a land use policy, really focusing on agriculture. So if you look amongst then kind of the 5 counties, that kind of same hierarchy, again, is kind of consistent across the 5. There's some differences as you start to see with Greene County, Monroe, Kalamazoo, in the rural categories, kind of a second kind of land use policy type of rural residential. So you sort of get into some very low density, larger parcel size, rural residential. They've captured that as part of their land use plan. And then you see some things like some nuances. Again, a lot of times this will have to do with state enabling legislation, like Johnson County and Iowa. You kind of see the dotted lines around some of the the communities and the larger Iowa city. So those are 2-mile community planning area. So the state kind of gives those communities, empowers them to think about planning for the areas of their future future growth. So again, this hierarchy, this typology of city edges and rural is pretty consistent. And later on, when we talk about the scenarios, we'll kind of use that hierarchy to talk about how we can kind of shape the scenarios for Boone County. So overview of the growth scenarios, trying to get into kind of the 3 growth scenarios we've been looking at. And before we kind of get into those, and I apologize in terms of kind of committing the cardinal sin of presentations, a lot of spreadsheets. But I think in terms of we want to have these available so that you can download these later and look at these in more detail. So if you looked at our discovery report, we had in there some information about the popularity and growth of rural residential in the county. So rural properties, rural housing on larger acreage, 5, 10 acres, et cetera. So we did a little bit deeper dive in terms of not only kind of that rural residential, but what are the kind of existing residential densities in different parts of the county and in the cities. So we looked at it from a couple different ways. One was looking at what are some of the sizes of single family parcels in different areas of the county. And I'll come back to the spreadsheet more on the next slide. But what we found was, if you look here on the bottom, for the cities, actually we're pretty consistent. Even amongst Columbia and Ashland and Centralia and Hallsville, the median parcel size of single family homes were pretty consistent amongst all those cities, about a third of an acre. As we move out into kind of the unincorporated areas, areas near Columbia, kind of Columbia's edge, a little bit larger in terms of single family parcel size, not quite half an acre. But then as we got out into the other areas of the unincorporated counties, and even within the edge areas of some of the smaller cities like Ashland, Centralia, and Hallsville, the median parcel size was much bigger, 5 to 6 plus acres. Again, this is median parcel size to the sort of middle, not necessarily the average, because especially once you get into unincorporated areas, some larger parcels can skew the average. So we looked at the median parcel size. So we start to kind of overlay then kind of thinking about, again, like I mentioned, kind of cities, rural and edges. So again, cities, not surprisingly, more, more dense. As you see here, again, the spreadsheet kind of shows single family parcel size. The important part of residential density is also incorporates things like apartments, condos. So you factor that into obviously, then cities, increases that density. So again, cities, pretty consistent with the single family parcel size. The rural and then the edge areas of, again, some of the smaller towns, again, also pretty consistent, but with a much larger single family parcel size. So it was important to think about that existing trend, because as we started to develop the scenarios, the first one we wanted to really develop was looking at projecting existing trends out into the future. So how does that then kind of translate into an actual scenarios? So as Bob mentioned, the county is projected to have up to 37,000 new housing units would be needed in Boone County by 2050. Again, that was kind of the upper range of that projection Bob went over. If you looked at our discovery report over the winter, there's approximately 80,000 existing housing units in Boone County. Again, these are all types of housing, single family, apartments, condos, et cetera. So all types of housing. And then you kind of see the color coding there in terms of Columbia has the most housing, unincorporated, the next, and then the other towns, Ashland, Centray, and other cities. So basically, we've looked at three different scenarios in terms of where growth could go in the future, and then what some of those assumptions are with those different scenarios. So scenario one we've called the current trend, city edges and rural states. So the background with scenario one is cities continue to develop with current development trends and density. Do development mostly happen how it does now on vacant or greenfield sites, so basically undeveloped sites. The edges of the cities will continue to develop kind of based on current trends and densities, although those densities would vary a little bit, somewhat by city. And in the rural areas, again, kind of continued popularity of rural residential on large parcels, those 5+ acre parcels. So in terms of land use policies, a general continuance of existing land use policies. And then if you look at the county's zoning ordinance, and other policy documents, what's there now is from a policy perspective is to preserve a good agricultural land, maximize the use of existing infrastructure, and discourage development where services are not readily accessible, and also emphasis on sewer and water availability for new development in edge areas. So that's scenario one. So scenario two would be city-focused development. So a greater emphasis on new development in existing city limits, including a greater emphasis on infill development in those cities. So when I use the word infill, what I mean is redevelopment of underutilized property. So sometimes you see in a city perhaps a vacant commercial space, et cetera. So the redevelopment or reuse of some of those perhaps underutilized properties. And also greater densities of greenfield sites when developed. So basically greater residential densities when you have new residential. So in terms of land use policies, likely the need for changes in both city and unincorporated land use policies. So in the unincorporated areas, changes in land use policies to further encourage or direct growth in the cities. One of the things we're doing now is evaluating lessons learned and best practices from those other counties in terms of things like urban service areas, minimal residential parcel size, et cetera. But then also probably needed changes in policies for the cities in terms of policies to encourage infill and higher densities. Then scenario three, what we're calling rural growth. So increased development in rural areas, especially rural residential. So in terms of land use policies there, allowance of smaller residential parcel sizes in more unincorporated areas of the county, more commercial opportunities in unincorporated areas. And again, we heard some of this, again, I wouldn't call it maybe prevalent, but we did hear some of this in our engagement and the survey results last fall in terms of, folks that maybe have property in rural areas say, why can't we do more with our property? So again, as you think about these different scenarios, again, we kind of wanted to explore the impacts of these, not necessarily say, picking one of these per se, but exploring kind of what some of the impacts are of these. And again, perhaps again, it may be a preference toward one, but also then thinking about, again, the lessons learned from each of these scenarios. So I want to kind of show you a few visuals, then kind of get into, I think the core part is really kind of the numbers, then, the resulting numbers behind the scenarios. So if you looked at the discovery report, we had a lot of maps of the county. And again, Boone County is a big county. So when you start looking at the maps, things just become a little, blurred in terms of colors here and there. So we wanted to do a couple of visuals, just kind of give, some sense of what these scenarios could look like. So we picked kind of a rural location of the county. So I mentioned kind of that typology of cities, edges, and rural. So we picked a rural location and kind of did kind of three sketches of what maybe the scenarios sort of kind of look like. So you kind of get a sense of what they look like, and then in a similar area of the county. Just a few notes. These are a general visualization. We tried to they're based on kind of real conditions, but we tried to do a prototypical representation of the county. Obviously, the county is diverse in terms of rolling hills and parts of the county, flat farmland, and others. So it tries to kind of capture all that in kind of one sketch. And it's also not meant to be exact representation of, again, kind of all the current policies. And kind of keep that in mind in terms of as you look at these. So the first one is current trends, the city edges and rural estates. And again, you see this in many areas of the county now, where you have rural residential on large, often, as I said, median 5 acres or more, kind of scattered in, kind of then farmland or natural habitat in the county. So again, you see this in many locations throughout the county. So kind of the same location, kind of same view on city focused. So in some ways, maybe you could say like kind of going back in time before this area was developed, when it's still predominantly farmland. But you also still have some areas of the county where it's kind of still close to this in terms of farms or pastures or natural areas. And then the third view of rural growth. And rural growth gets a little tricky in terms of thinking about maybe those potential densities, since a lot of it's dependent on availability of utilities, especially sewer. But when some of those areas are accessible in terms of utilities, sometimes you start to see leapfrog subdivisions, kind of pockets of higher density in different areas. Rural commercial. Right now, ag. Most of the county rural areas are zoned ag. Some limitations in terms of what you can do commercially. If you had again more uses allowed. Commercial again is very dependent on location to customers, location to employees. But I think as you travel around, you kind of see in other parts of the state, other parts of the country, in terms of types of rural development kind of happening at sometimes key intersections, et cetera. So again, kind of maybe a little bit of a flavor of what that rural growth could look like. So getting into, again, I apologize in terms of kind of the density of this slide, but again, a lot of good information. And this kind of gets into breaking down in terms of numbers, kind of what those different scenarios mean. So we looked at kind of see three charts here. One is scenario 1, but then we've kind of done 2 options for scenario 2, and then scenario 3, rural growth. So we've looked at with these charts. I'm going to walk you through the impacts then of getting that 37,000 total housing units, how to achieve that through the scenarios and their impacts kind of in the cities, the edge areas, and then the rural areas. So I'll start with kind of on the left, on the far left, scenario 1, city edges and rural estates. So the area you kind of see in light brown are areas of the city. So what we did to kind of get these numbers, we took the future land use plan of each city. Ashland, Centralia, and Hallsville, they've updated their comprehensive plans fairly recently. Columbia, their comprehensive plan was from 2011, 2013 range, so a little bit older. So we looked at their comprehensive plans and their future land use plans, and looked at based on those areas that they're as residential, those areas that could still be developed within the cities. And then we also then look, calculated what their existing residential densities were. So So this is both, single family and then, other, multifamily, et cetera. So we, calculated what their existing existing residential densities were in terms of units and acres. So that gives us then, in terms of then on the far left, kind of in some ways, it's a capacity analysis in terms of potential housing units in those cities. So as you see there, kind of on the left, well short of that 37,000 needed housing units, and in some ways, probably the number we're showing maybe even somewhat optimistic in terms of I think people recognize that areas don't always come up for development, even if it's available over time. Sometimes things are held as undeveloped land, so we may be even optimistic in terms of that number. Edge areas, kind of the same methodology. We took the future land use plans and again looked at areas of potential development, excluding things like floodplains and other things that couldn't be developed. And I will note here, and we have it in the notes here at the bottom. I mentioned kind of the trend of Ashland, Centralia, and Hallsville. Very low density in terms of some of the residential around those cities. If development occurred near the city limits, would it be higher than what we're showing? Probably, if it's right right next to the city limits. But it's good in terms of, at least as a comparison on numbers, kind of showing some of the impacts of if those areas do get hemmed in by those larger residential estates, kind of what the impacts are in terms of housing units. So about 8,000 number there. So this still leaves us well short. So then to get to that 37,000, you'd be looking at about 7,500 or so housing units, in the rural areas, and then again kind of based on that low density, kind of larger parcel size, using a fair amount of acreage. So to get that 37,000 total housing units, over 50,000 acres of land being used. To kind of put things in perspective, the entire area of Boone County is approximately 440,000 acres. I'll also mention too, this 7,500 housing units in the unincorporated areas would be about twice the historical average of housing units kind of in the rural areas outside of Columbia's edge. So typically about 10 or 12% of housing units are kind of in that rural areas of kind of the total share of housing in the county. So looking at the city-focused scenario, and again, kind of two options. So option A, again, we kind of held, how do we get to 37,000? So we looked at, again, looking at about a 10% increase in residential densities, in the city, and this keeps the acres the same. I mentioned earlier about, part of city focus could also be looking at underutilized sites. So this doesn't include any of that. So it could be even potentially more acreage. We kept acreage the same. So it gives us a little bit of a jump there in terms of housing units. The edge areas, here we took the existing city densities and then used half that. So for Columbia, the existing residential densities in the city is 3.6 units an acre. So for the edge area, we've used 1.8. For Ashland, for example, 2.2. So we used 1.1. So kind of based on real densities, but then kind of scaling it down in terms of becoming less dense, getting away from the city edge. So again, kind of much greater impact in terms of how many housing units are available, and then that only then in terms of getting it through that 37,000 in terms of housing units in unincorporated areas, about 1,700. So again, much less impact in terms of total acres. So with those increases in density, 37,000 units, about 25,000 acres, less than half of then scenario one in terms of those densities. Now scenario two, option B, here we looked at in terms of what would be some potential densities, and then what would the result be. So for this one, we in the cities, we looked at what would happen if the densities were increased in future. Again, this is future development. 25%. So for Columbia, that'd be about 4.5 units an acre. Still, fairly in terms of, fairly low, especially when we look at some of our, research and other, county planning. For the edge areas, we've matched existing city densities. So basically kind of carrying existing city densities out to those edge areas. And again, much again, much greater impact than in terms of total units, and then only 925 units in the rural areas. So that would give us even less total acreage, but even more housing units. So again, compared to scenario one, less than half of that total acreage, but 36% more housing units. And then scenario three, rural growth, again, this one in terms of some logical assumptions, logical estimates in terms of potential rural densities. It's a little challenge. Again, a lot of that density is based on the availability of utility availability, and so thinking about expanded rural growth, where that could be, it gets a little bit more challenging. So we did kind of raise the density for those rural areas. Kept edge the same and actually lessened a little bit for the cities. Again, here the 37,000 units equals, again, somewhat similar to kind of existing scenario one, about 58,000 acres. So you kind of see again kind of the range of impacts in terms of the different densities of future housing, future residential, in terms of then the usage of land. And I will say with all these, again, they're estimates in terms of usage. So maybe in some areas we've been over optimistic in terms of available areas. Some areas we've been perhaps underestimated amount of areas. But I think it does start to show the again kind of the impacts and what those densities mean. I think especially important in terms of thinking about the edge areas of like Ashland, Centralia, and Hallsville, how those areas grow, and being able to have housing in those areas. So you really start to kind of see some of those differences. Now we don't have a slide for the jobs numbers. One, I think we want to kind of concentrate kind of on this because this is kind of the bigger, some ways the bigger story. And two, looking with the jobs, again we looked at the rural, the land use plans of the cities, both kind of within the city and the edge areas. And in some ways, kind of based on those existing areas, we've kind of calculated that there is amongst all the scenarios in terms of space for that job growth. As we'll talk a little bit later on in terms of the evaluation, it's important to keep in mind in terms of certain job sectors may need certain sites that may be important to keep in mind as we do the land use plan. And it also gets a little challenging in terms of calculating jobs per acre that obviously different jobs, retail has a much kind of different job density than say warehousing or logistics or office. So it gets a little harder to look at that, but kind of based on some of the existing jobs per acre for the different cities in the county, and looking at some of those available areas based on future land use plans. You're not quite as impactful in terms of needing future more land to accommodate that growth. So I'm going to kind of start to turn it over to the different members of the team now to kind of walk you through the evaluation of the scenario. So again, I mentioned I had shown this slide earlier in terms of describing this as key issues, and also mentioning that we're starting to use these then to evaluate the scenarios. So we're going to kind of walk you through a qualitative discussion of for each of these criteria, how do they kind of then are they impacted then by the different scenarios? And as we walk through and you kind of see, we kind of have a sliding scale of strong benefits down to low benefits. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and he can start with transportation.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Neal. I'm a senior planner with Lockmuller Group, focusing on transportation and how we can evaluate each of these growth scenarios through the lens of transportation, and particularly with some of those um, criteria that reflect a lot of the needs and aspirations that we've heard from Boone County residents throughout the planning process. Um, we'll start up in the top left corner with supporting multiple modes of transportation. Then we think about each of these growth scenarios' capacity to do so. When we're talking about multiple modes of transportation, we know in addition to motor vehicles, people are traveling in and around the community on bike, on foot, by transit. So how do these scenarios support the viability, safety, connectivity of these options? As you'll see, that scenario number 2, our city-focused option, really affords the greatest benefit to those other modes, particularly because the travel range for people walking and biking is a little bit less, as you might assume, than those traveling by vehicle. So by locating popular destinations, whether it's school, employment, parks, retail, um, entertainment, education, if we put all those in closer proximity to where people live, it opens the door for more active transportation trips. Similarly with transit, transit loves density. So the more growth that occurs within the city, the more opportunities we have to support transit. And that could be through more direct routes. It could be through shorter headways, the time between buses along the same route, for example. Conversely, when we look at those, the rural growth scenario, by spreading people out, it creates challenges for not just walking and biking and the capacity of the roadways to support those activities, but also can be more challenging for traditional transit services. Somewhere along the same lines, looking at reducing travel time, a lot of the principles of reducing travel time, we start by thinking about the distance between trip origins and trip destinations. We also think about what kind of methods we may have available to reduce travel time based on within the existing systems through intelligent transportation systems, dynamic signal timing to address congested or peak periods of travel, and ultimately more significant measures like increasing capacity. So with in terms of reducing travel time, that city focus scenario 2, again, performing highly in comparison to rural growth. The further people are away from their destinations, typically we're going to just see longer travel times. Looking at our third criteria in the bottom left corner, increasing safety, you'll notice the circles on each of those scales are a little bit more concentrated in the middle. And we did that intentionally because we believe that within each growth scenario, there are safety countermeasures that can be employed to improve safety. But within each scenario, there are some nuances. For example, in scenario 3, our rural growth scenario, increased residential development along some of the rural roads may put strain on those roads and exacerbate some of the existing issues and crash hotspots in those areas. In our city focus scenario, more people closer to their destinations reduces travel time, reduces exposure or risk to crashes. But we just do need to be careful in that particular scenario to consider the needs of people walking and biking. In that city focus scenario, we'll see more vulnerable road users on the street. So we want to be cognizant of what tools we have in place, like safe and connected active travel networks, what those can do to improve safety for our road users. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jessica to talk about our natural resources evaluation.
Thank you so much. I'm Jessica Hardesty Norris here in Columbia, and I have pardon me. I am an ecological planner with a firm biohabitats specializing in ecosystems. I think I'll do something similar, walking through these three criteria for each one of the areas that we evaluated. I'll explain a little bit about what are the measurable things that we look at for that, and then walk through it, but how they are affected by the three scenarios. So in the upper left-hand corner is the most straightforward, probably. If we just think about important habitats and sensitive areas, the thing to remember is that habitat works well if it's connected to other habitat. So little tiny isolated patches of fragmented habitat don't work well. So any land use scenarios or planning that can concentrate people and development away or into, concentrated areas is going to reduce that fragmentation and make it easier to protect important habitats in sensitive areas. So for the first natural resource criteria of important habitats, the scenario number one be moderate city focused would probably be the most where it's easiest to preserve habitats, and rural growth makes it quite difficult to those 58,000 acres spread across the county make it difficult to maintain cores of connected habitat. Like Kevin, I'll move to the right and look at the water quality. So just definitionally, water quality is always improved by contact with soil and with roots. So if water falls on a forest and runs underground or across the surface to a waterway, then it's going to be pretty clean. If it's falling on impervious surfaces and roads and picking up car pollutants, you might have some issues with pollutant loads. The development that is spread out in that third scenario is going to likely affect more waterways just in terms of the surface area that's covered again. So the lowest benefit scenario for water quality is that rural growth scenario number 3. And scenarios 1 and 2 fall more in the middle with a little bit of an advantage to city focus because you're less likely to impact new waterways that are not already under tight management and heavily influenced by human activities. So down in the corner, under the third criteria that we use for the evaluation of these scenarios in terms of the natural resources is flood risk and reducing flooding. So again, sort of definitionally, some kinds of land use shed water very quickly. So prairie or a forest or a field or a pasture, water would be absorbed, and if it's hitting impervious surfaces or unnatural surfaces, it might be making its way to the waterways a lot faster, and so you get runoff from roofs in cities and roads everywhere, and that creates a sudden influx of water into those waterways, and that makes a very flashy sort of sudden eruptive kind of dynamic to the hydrology and the hydraulics of the waterways. And that's really what causes localized flooding. The other thing that natural resource planning, we like to say that, flooding is just where people meet water. So if there are no resources around infrastructure that people are concerned about, if there aren't buildings or infrastructure in next to rivers, I'm not going to call it flooding. It's just the water's going up and down sometimes. So it's important to think about what we place in floodways as part of the way that we think about reducing flooding or addressing flood risk. And because of that, in great part, the 3 are really quite clustered with those scenario 1, 2, and 3. So you can decide as a community that you want to create great incentives to store water higher up in the watershed, and you can implement those sorts of practices under any of the 3 scenarios. There's a slight difference. So for instance, we were sort of considering that maybe in scenario 3, there might be more people spread out farther. So there might be more often or more likely to have a road closure that was affecting more people because you just have more places that people are trying to access if under the rural growth scenarios. But in general, the flooding and flood risk stays pretty consistent in terms of like the overall synthesis of it for natural resources. So that's it for natural resources, and I will similarly pass off.
All right, I'm back. I realize I think I didn't formally introduce myself the last time I spoke. I'm Bob Lewis. I currently teach urban planning and development at St. Louis University. I started there in 2018. And after 42 years of being a practicing urban planner and economist, mostly in the consulting field, and continue to work with Stephen and Jackie and Kevin and others on research in economics and demographics for master planning. So you heard from me a lot earlier on housing growth based on population scenarios. This and with continued growth in Boone County, the largest demand for land, as Stephen has emphasized as well, will be for housing. As we noted earlier, population growth is expected, but it will be coupled with lower average household sizes of, we're not quite sure where, but certainly lower. So housing land demand will likely expand faster than population itself. So one of the goals suggested here is to use that growth to provide a wide variety of housing options, but not only for new residents or net new residents, also for the changing population of today's Boone County residents as they move through different stages of life, smaller housing, bigger housing, family housing, elderly housings, et cetera. Walkable housing, wide open spaces, and so forth. So the study of land use patterns in the precedent counties confirmed what we think most of us would expect for a variety of housing under different growth scenarios. Let me walk through a little summary of that. The variety of housing options include, of course, single-family homes on large rural lots, ranging downward in terms of upward in density, to medium and higher density apartments in more urbanized or suburbanized areas. This particular graphic here indicates that we anticipate that the widest variety of housing is and would remain related to cities. See, that is, scenario 2. This is driven by a range of transportation systems and networks that Kevin talked about, by the location of jobs, and by location of places for shopping and recreation. Where do we all gather? That kind of land, or land near those nodes, tends to be of higher value in the market, which then puts pressure on the number of housing units we can put on an acre of land or a half acre of land. And at the higher the value of the land, the more economical it is to build higher density housing. And cities, virtually by definition, are bastions of relative density. Alternatively, continued growth that's focused on the city edges, such as Boone County is already experiencing, and suggested here for scenario 1, are responses to market forces that will likely discourage broad diversity in housing. Land use patterns from the precedent counties confirm that as well. City edges tend to favor single-family homes, either in rural lots or in many cases expanding subdivisions. Apartments and higher density options are less likely, though it's important to think about how certain nodes, as I mentioned, might be more appropriate for higher density, even in these more ex-urban rural areas. Think of intersections of major roads and highways where land values can tend to be a bit higher, so housing density is more economical, even in more distant areas, as is, by the way, commercial development and economic development that Jackie's going to talk about. Jackie or Beth are going to talk about here in a few minutes. In most ways, scenario 3 is much the same. The economics of lower values of land in most rural areas don't automatically command higher density housing. Instead, the market defers to higher value housing units, larger units in single family formats, because the price of the land can be discounted. Thus, we wouldn't expect a wide variety of housing choices in scenario 3, much like scenario 1. Though some variety, again, should be anticipated, particularly at those nodes where people and vehicles come together. With that, I'm going to shift it over, I think, to Stephen to talk infrastructure.
Thanks, Bob. So this evaluation looks at infrastructure and community services and 3 aspects of that in terms of response time for emergency services, cost effectively expand and maintain utilities, and school enrollment. So I'll start with school enrollment. And school enrollment is one where, again, gets a little nuanced, a little tricky in terms of evaluating in terms of from the 3 scenarios, because proportionally, all 3 scenarios will have the same population growth, as Bob mentioned. With the smaller household size, perhaps proportionally in the future in terms of the population growth, it may be less kind of school age families. Again, kind of based on maybe some of those smaller household assumptions. But then the school districts in the county, and if you look back at our discovery report for the winter, we have the maps of the school districts. All the school districts overlap between cities and then edge areas and rural areas. So in terms of the kind of share of those going to different ones and how those might be impacted by the scenarios, a little hard to say there might be strong differentiation in terms of impacts between the between the 3. Going to response time for emergency services and expansion and maintenance of utilities, both of those are very predicated on more efficiencies when development is closer together, when it's more clustered together. And we have a couple of diagrams to help illustrate that. The first diagram is looking at response time. So again, even with first responders, emergency responders, there's some nuances. You think about response times for the police, not necessarily always a fixed point, right? There's a lot of times police are out on patrols, so there's some differences in terms of response time. But things like fire districts, ambulance providers, a little bit more fixed stations and fixed service from those. So what you see there in kind of diagram A, what we're trying to demonstrate is kind of a fixed point from a fire station, and then in terms of a mapped ideal response time. So an isochrome map, which is kind of a map of travel time. So you think about we all do this every day in terms of looking at Google Maps on your phone, maybe asking for direction, and it tells you it's 10 minutes away. Well, if you ask that Google Maps, let me know all the places I can go in 10 minutes, right? It will kind of give you kind of a map similar to kind of like what you see here in terms of kind of more of a amoeba shape. It's not a perfect circle because you can travel faster on some roads than others. And obviously this also varies different times of day, et cetera, with more traffic. So diagram A looks again, it kind of shows if development is more clustered together, you're serving more say households or development in a fixed radius of time, whereas in diagram B, more spread out growth, you're covering less of those households, less of those developments in a fixed period of time. And then diagram C starts to show then some of the inefficiencies of facilities, of capital, and then long-term maintenance in terms of as you start to add additional infrastructure, in this case, and another say station, again you're starting to pick up some of those missing developments, but again you're not being as efficient, right? You're not being as efficient with your coverage. So again, it illustrates some real world examples of coverage and density. The Next one kind of shows an example of infrastructure. And again, sometimes it's hard to put numbers on impacts of infrastructure because you have so many different different types. You have different types of roads. Sometimes it's a concrete street. Sometimes it's an asphalt. Sometimes you have different types of utilities. So we kind of chose kind of one utility as kind of an example, just kind of to show what the impacts of that. We had some numbers in terms of some master plan pricing of new new water lines, and based on those master plans, about $300,000 a mile of new new water lines. So we break that down, say looking at a half mile and looking at some different development densities. So if you have 5 or 6 acre lots, you have about 10 homes that could fit on that half acre road. And again, there's some nuances here that if you had more rectangular lots and more narrow street frontages, you could have a couple more houses. But again, just as a point of comparison, I think it's fairly representative. So about $15,000 a home in terms of the cost of that new water line. Where you go down to the bottom in terms of 1 acre lots. Again, it's about a little bit over 6,000. And again, if you had half acre, quarter acre lots, even more. So again, it starts to show the impact of those costs in terms of, again, the kind of the spread out density. And some of those impacts. Now, it's important to note too that obviously some of these costs aren't directly for that individual house, spread across the customer base or the district, but you start to kind of see some of those impacts of density and cost of infrastructure. I'm going to turn it over to Beth to talk about economic development.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, I'm Beth Noonan with Community and Economic Development Solutions. My partner, Jackie Wellington, and I are focused on the economic development aspects of the planning process. In terms of the growth scenarios, we looked at 3 criteria: availability of developable sites, attraction and retention of workforce, and the scenario's ability to support targeted industry cluster development. With respect to developable sites, what we're really talking about here is property that is of sufficient size and acreage with access to infrastructure, which I mean by that utilities, roads, rail, etc., that enable those sites to accommodate commercial or industrial development. Developable sites can be on greenfields, that is, in places that have never seen development, but they can also be in infill sites where a property no longer has a viable use, and so it presents an opportunity to reinvest and redevelop in a community. In terms of the scenarios, we really did feel that scenario 1 provided the strongest benefits or the opportunity to maximize the creation of developable sites, particularly light industrial development, by fostering growth that's in and around the perimeters of the city. The benefits of that is that there are proximity to infrastructure, so you can extend infrastructure more easily, and that reduces the overall cost of development. At the same time, scenario 1 does offer the opportunity to assemble larger pieces of property for larger developments. Scenario 2 does have the benefit of proximity to infrastructure, so again, reduced costs. But we noted that in Ready's strategic plan, they noted that there was a real serious lack of urban infill redevelopment opportunity sites. And so then you have that challenge, and then there are also less of an opportunity to develop larger sites for bigger users. Scenario 3, rural growth does provide broad opportunities for creating developable sites because you have a lot of property and a lot of availability, but development in rural areas, however, would require the greatest investment in infrastructure, so cost may be a limiting factor for that scenario. In terms of attraction and retention of workforce, having an available workforce is a key to economic growth in any community, and Boone County is no different. We again felt that scenario 1 offered the most benefits in that commercial and industrial development would be centered around the county's population centers, which provides residents with access to jobs and then employers or businesses with access to workers. Being close in and around the urban areas, though, does provide some opportunities for retention because employees really are looking for a quality of life amenities like housing, transportation services, restaurants, entertainment, all those kinds of things that are critical for retaining your workforce. The city focus, has very similar kinds of benefits in terms of the ability to attract workforce and retain them. But the lack of large developable sites may limit job opportunities for certain job sectors, which made it slightly less beneficial on that score. We really did feel that rural growth seems unlikely to positively influence attraction and retention of workforce because that lack of proximity to transportation, to the amenities that we're talking about that are available in your developed cities, makes it harder to attract workers in that scenario. One thing that we would note is that the availability of housing options that are affordable for younger workers and young families will be critical to retaining workers in the community under any of these growth scenarios. Finally, we looked at targeted industry clusters and how well the different scenarios supported those. Again, economic growth is based on, comes primarily in most communities from existing industry sectors and from emerging sectors that are all based in local strengths that develop out of what comes naturally to you. Fostering a diverse industry cluster base is really critical for having a sustainable long-term economic growth. One of the things we really felt, though, again, is that scenario one did offer the most support for growing targeted industry clusters, typically because businesses in similar industries benefit from geographic proximity to each other. They share common needs, so they may have the same kinds of workforce needs. They may have the same kind of infrastructure needs or transportation corridors, et cetera. And they also may benefit from a proximity to institutions that provide them with some kind of important support that advances their businesses, so R&D labs. Similarly, entrepreneurship in any of the growth sectors would benefit from being in and around resources like business support services, universities, et cetera, that help you grow that. A great example is the Route B development with the food manufacturers, where they've all clustered together. That kind of tells you how that cluster development occurs, and we felt that scenario one did really support that. City focused also has significant opportunities to support targeted industry growth for much of the same reasons as scenario one, but the lack of developable land that reduces the opportunities to attract sort of larger established firms that may have larger space requirements, or that whose uses are incompatible with existing land use, make it somewhat less of a supportive environment for targeted industry cluster growth. Finally, rural growth really does offer some real benefits for growing key industry clusters because you can tailor large swaths of greenfield development to the specific needs of a particular industry or group of similar businesses. So, a development of a research park is a classic example. So you do have that opportunity in rural growth. One of the drawbacks, again, is the cost of development because of the need to extend infrastructure. And it really does require a sustained economic development strategy if you're focusing on creating a whole cluster in an undeveloped area. With that, I will turn it back over to Stephen Ivandahl.
Thanks, Beth. We're almost done here. Our last evaluation, rural character, and two parts of this: preserve farmland and preserve scenic views and rural atmosphere. And both of these, again, very, very similar in terms of the overall evaluation. Obviously, rural character, scenic views, rural atmosphere very subjective, right? And very beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Some people may prefer natural undisturbed habitats, and people may prefer farm fields and farmsteads, or a combination of both. Preserve farmland a little bit more straightforward in terms of preserving those agricultural soils and areas. But again, in terms of evaluating those, again, kind of part of it is how is development kind of spread out, and is it starting to take up some of those areas? So again, for both of these, scenario 2, more growth, toward the cities, preserves again those rural and farm ag areas. Scenario 1, kind of the current trends, again, kind of more in the middle, and then rural growth, the lowest rating of, again, the three scenarios. So with that concludes our presentation. Really appreciate everyone attending this evening and going through with us all that information and data. Really appreciate your time this evening. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we'll have in-person listening sessions later on in April. So again, I would encourage you, and we'll have this information on the website as we move forward. But again, I would encourage you, if you'd like to talk more in depth, share your thoughts in person, or your comments in person, please plan to attend those coming up. And again, with that kind of ends our formal presentation. If you'd be happy to stay on if you'd like to ask any questions or comments. As I mentioned earlier, again, I think you're looking for feedback in terms of things like, do you have a preference for one of the scenarios, or perhaps elements of those? As we talk about the different criteria, is there certain criteria that perhaps is more important to you, or would weigh more for you as you sort of evaluate the future of Boone County? So again, if you'd like to ask a question, you put your name in the chat. I think you can also choose to raise your hand in the chat. We'll unmute you. You can say your name. If you represent an organization, please say your organization, and also kind of maybe give us a sense of where you live in the county in terms of unincorporated versus what city. So I'm going to stop share and kind of bring the team up. All the team is available. So do we have anyone who would like to ask a question?
We definitely have some familiar faces out there.
Am I missing any raised? Am I from the team? Am I missing any raised hands?
Yeah, well, Ken has a question. Ken Schneeberger. I'm seeing that in the webinar chat, 2 hosts and panelists. Is that the? I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's he's asking about climate change, and you're right. I didn't talk about climate change I think that there's factors regarding climate change in several of these, but at least for the natural resources, there's we're looking at habitat being managed and having services that are a little bit different under projected drought scenarios, and flashiness and flood is also predicted to increase with climate change and with accelerating land use change. So it's kind of together, at least for the natural resources part.
I think I have Ken has raised his hand. So Ken, I'm gonna unmute you, and I'm pretty sure, I think from our your video won't come on; it will just be your audio. So Ken, I'm gonna unmute you, and please state your name.
Yeah, Ken Schneeberger. I was just making sure that you saw my question about taking consideration of changing environment and climate change, those kinds of things that we seem to be facing quicker than we had anticipated, say 5 or 10 years ago.
Sure, no, I appreciate that, yeah, and we did see that come in, so thank you, Ken. I think I saw someone else, then they put their hand down. Staff. You're unmuted.
Hello. Can you hear us?
Yes, yes.
The
Yeah,
question from the group here, why was St. Louis not considered as part of the precedent comparison county?
I'm sorry, I had a little trouble hearing. Why was St. Louis not chosen as one of the precedent counties?
Correct.
In terms of like St. Louis region as a whole, or just like this, was there part of the reason in terms of that?
Yes,
Yeah.
and its impact on the surrounding area.
I'll get it. Okay, I can do it.
Yeah, I think we were trying to keep, I think we were trying to keep the precedent counties to some of a manageable number. We'd talk about doing 3 to 5. And we ended up doing 5. If we got more than that, we would end up sort of hard to kind of wrap your arms around. Then kind of comparing one to the other. We also wanted to I think pick counties that were again similar to Boone in terms of that kind of city focused typology where you've got Boone and then Columbia, and then kind of the surrounding rural and smaller towns where St. Louis and its environs in terms of some of the collar counties are also growing very very quickly, but it's a little different kind of regional context in terms of a metropolitan area of 2+ million versus a fast growing county kind of out by itself that's 180,000 now and growing. So that's kind of So, but again, I think as we move forward, if there's lessons learned, from here, from this St. Louis region, it doesn't preclude us then in terms of, using some lessons learned or other tools, elsewhere too. So, thank you for that.
Ask you a question.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Was there another question on the live site?
Did it send it?
Yeah.
So, like, I don't know where the camera is, but 84% of Missouri's counties are dying, meaning the death rate is greater than the birth rate. Of Missouri's 114 counties, 78% saw population declines according to the 2020 census. The net in-migration to Boone County, and I'm less sure about this fact, is about 8,000 people over the last decade. And I just want to know, as consultants, if you looked at these other rural communities to see what's happening to them, because my concern is they're getting quite fragile. They're like dipping into like 4,000 people in some of these rural counties. And I think when life becomes kind of untenable in places like Nottoway or Ripley, that they're moving to places like Greene and Boone. And I just want to know if you're considering that in your studies.
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly, you're asking in terms of kind of migration from other Missouri counties to Boone in terms of that. I might let Bob pop in on this too, since it's kind of a demographic question. So we're looking at those growth rates as Bob mentioned. In terms of where those folks are coming from, in terms of that growth, the last 20 years and looking out over the next 20+ years. We don't always have all the details in terms of exactly where those folks are coming from. But, we are kind of accounting, again, I think, we don't see the county growing faster the next 20 years than they have, currently. So, we are kind of keeping those overall numbers in mind. Bob, did you have anything else to kind of chime in on?
Yeah, she raised a perfect question. An issue, of course, is our responsibility here is a master plan for Boone County and what's going to happen there. But where are the people coming from for Boone County, particularly in light of some of the demographic, the vital statistics you mentioned, deaths exceeding births and that sort of thing, and that's happening throughout the United States, but certainly in rural counties and cities, kind of everywhere. Boone County as a whole is something of an exception to that. And I would say the small cities, the rural parts of Boone County benefit from the infrastructure that's in Boone County, the university and the medical center, the universities, medical centers in the job, all that within Boone County, along with I-70 and access to the state capitol and things like that. So it has some advantages that say Northwest Missouri does not. That said, your question should be raised not only here, but with state officials, with economic development officials in Missouri and elsewhere, et cetera. How are we going to manage some of that decline elsewhere while jobs, economic activity, recreation, education, healthcare continue to concentrate in our cities throughout the United States and certainly in Missouri. So there are, most of the counties in Missouri are negatively affected by this population shift. What do we do about it? Let's have a long meeting one day and talk about it, but it's probably not the appropriate topic for this particular master plan. Thank you, though, Riley. That's a great question.
Thank you.
And
If now is not the time to talk about it in this master plan, when it starts to affect Boone County, I guess, what's the expiration date on this master plan? How long do you think it will be before that starts to impact our plan?
Well, from technically, we're looking at 20 to 30 years. As Boone County grows, there may indeed be negative growth impacts in other counties. We're not denying that. We're just not saying where and how that's going to happen or how Boone County might react to that. Now, I might add a little bit controversially, perhaps, is that Boone County is the main county in what the U.S. Census defines as a metropolitan area of Columbia, which also includes Howard and Cooper. But the numbers that I've been running show over that period of time I'm talking about, next 20, 30 years, that Boone County is going to continue to grow, partly at the expense of Howard and Howard County as well, and Cooper, because they're much more rural and suffering from the kinds of effects that you've just mentioned. You raise a point, maybe our plan should note that challenge, but it actually is a bigger challenge that the Boone County people aren't going to be able to necessarily face directly. But joining up with other central Missouri and rural counties with some statewide impact, statewide analysis and policies might be wise. So let's ponder that.
I do want to move on to, I appreciate those comments and question. I'm going to move on to other question. Again, if you want to raise a question, ask a question. We want to make sure to kind of have you do it, not just through the chat, but do it verbally, so we kind of capture your name, which we always can't do just through the chat. So if you have a question, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand in the chat, and I can unmute you if you have. So I see Steve. I'm going to unmute you. Steve Calloway, can you introduce yourself?
Steve Calloway, community member. And my question was just, I heard you discuss the demographics as they pertain to family household size. And I think that's consistent with kind of what you were just talking about in terms of families and that sort of thing. But I just want to make sure I didn't miss something that maybe is a little more nuanced when we talk about family size and household size, because part of what I always think about also for Boone County is, you know, the public school district. So we have a really strong public school district. And so a lot of most of our families send their kids to public schools. And so that creates obviously some community needs when it comes to real estate taxes and personal property taxes and different things like that. So I'm just making sure I didn't miss a discussion as part of your analysis about some of those things. You know, how many seniors do we continue to have? We used to talk about Boone County was a desirable place where people wanted to move to Boone County to retire. And so that typically meant there were families that did not have school-age children. So just asking if you have anything to weigh in on that, or did I miss the discussion a little bit nuanced about that? Thank you.
Sure. I'll let Bob kind of touch on this too, some of those demographic things, and maybe I'll touch on maybe some things as he follows up. Go ahead, Bob.
Again, another good question. Thanks, Steve. The sort of the good news, maybe related to your question, is that the county will continue to grow and perhaps be adding children to the public school system, or at least not declining them. The question is, are we going to have as many kids per family? The answer is probably not. But more families means maybe stabilization of the school system. That said, where do they settle? Where are the schools going to be located? Are they going to be located where we build more housing or continue to reoccupy? We do have all those numbers, by the way. We didn't analyze them for this presentation because it takes too much time. That will be in the plan itself to give you some idea. But yes, we're also seeing an aging of a population, more single homes of older people, certainly not children homes of older people, childless, empty nesters. But young people coming too. The kind of job structure we expect and have in Boone County favors the working class. So and they tend to be the folks, of course, who have children. So I think we don't have a significant problem there, but we may not have a huge growth challenge.
Great, thank you.
I see Jackson with your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, Jackson, so you should be up.
Yes, hello. I'm repeating a question that I had written in the chat here. So I had asked, does this master plan have the opportunity to recommend a policy of some sort across the entire county and the municipalities within the counties to end the parking minimum mandates that exist in many of these cities? So just some background. A lot of these mandates force businesses and residences to build a lot more parking for each specific separate lot than would honestly be necessary. And if you look at the US as an average, there's only about 16% of the parking spaces that are ever going to be filled. And this is for a nation that has way more cars per capita than most other countries in the world. So the parking minimum mandates, I think, play a big role into that. Donald Shoup has written a book that some of you may be familiar with that addresses that as well. So just wanted to see if that can be addressed here in this master plan.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, you know, this master plan is really for the unincorporated jurisdiction. So, you know, we want to be, you know, in terms of things we may recommend for the cities, we're sensitive about in terms of, you know, encroaching on, you know, there's jurisdictions and their, you know, planning, you know, policies. Yeah, I mentioned in terms of, you know, with some of the scenarios in city, especially city focus, right? In terms of probably then concurrent changes to city policies. So in terms of kind of perhaps specificity in terms of commenting about the cities, I don't think, you know, we want to be careful in terms of encroaching on their jurisdictions on some of those issues. I appreciate the comment and the question. Andrew Sell, I'm going to unmute you.
There we go. So I guess I have a question sort of addressing sort of the growth that would be done in.
Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself just again?
Oh yeah, I guess I live in Columbia. I'm a Columbia resident. I guess I have a question about sort of would sort of the growth in these rural areas determined by the master plan. Is there any sort of mechanism that's being considered to maybe ensure like a diverse mix of housing is being built, or is that sort of out of the scope of this master plan?
No, I think again, housing options and the diversity of housing types, right, is super important. And obviously, you know, land use, you know, plays an important part, you know, of that. And so I think, you know, we'll, you know, also be kind of coordinating, you know, as I mentioned, the county has just kicked off, I think, with Columbia and other partners in terms of a detailed housing study. I actually just got a message during our presentation from the consultant for that study. We hadn't kind of met yet, if you will. So I think, you know, so that process, you know, I think will hopefully, you know, complement the work we're doing, and will complement our work or complement that work, in terms of, you know, looking at land use, and then, you know, perhaps more specific recommendations in terms of housing, you know, housing policies, that, you know, piggyback off our work. So yeah, the answer is definitely yes, in terms of, I think, the priority of, and what we heard last year during the engagement, the importance of, you know, trying to create more housing options and types, right?
Thank you.
Other hands, let's see. David Boston, I'm going to unmute you. Again, please introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Hey, I'm David Boston. I'm the consultant working on the countywide housing study.
Oh, perfect timing.
And yeah, thanks so much for doing this webinar. This has been great. I just wanted to plug the times because we're having a series of community meetings next week. And I thought this would be a great time to tell everybody what times those meetings are happening next week and where they're going to be. So I'm going to quickly run through that, but also if you, you know, miss what I'm saying, you can find these community meetings, the info for these meetings on the Boone County Upward Mobility website. So if you go to their website, you can find these meeting times there. But the meetings are next week. The first one is Monday, April 8th at 1:30 at the Columbia Public Library in the Friends Room. The next one is on Tuesday, April 9th at 1 p.m. at the Food Bank for Central and Northeast Missouri in the community room. The third meeting is in the same venue on the same day, but at 5 p.m. So there's the first one at 1 p.m. and then there's another one at 5 p.m. again at the Food Bank for Central and Northeast Missouri in the community room. And then the fourth meeting is on Wednesday, April 10th at 5:30 p.m. In the Hallsville Community Center. And then the fifth meeting is on Thursday, April 11th at 5:30 p.m. at the Ashland Optimist Club building. So that's all the meetings that we're having. Those are going to be community meetings with a lot of participation. So if you have thoughts on housing issues, come share them with us at those meetings. All right, that's all. I just wanted to make a plug, but I'm available. So if you want to pull me in, feel free.
appreciate the real-time collaboration, and we'll be, if you register for this meeting, for this webinar tonight, if you haven't already been getting our Boone e-blast, you'll be added to that e-blast list. So we'll send out an e-blast probably Friday or Monday with a link to the presentation tonight, and we'll also include a link to those meeting schedule, David.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Great. Let's see. Andrew Sell, I'm going to unmute you. Please introduce yourself.
I guess you did just unmute me previously. I don't think I have
Oh,
anything else.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Are you, any other questions?
No, I'm all good. Thank you.
Great. But it is getting late, so my technology brain is like maybe a little more fried. Oops, we heard from David already. Okay. Nick Shapiro, I'm unmute you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm Nick Shapiro. I'm with Greenbelt Land Trust of Mid-Missouri. We're a conservation land trust. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm pleased to see that across a lot of the priority areas, the city density option seems to score pretty high in most cases. My personal and my organizational interest is on sort of the natural resource side. My view is that we need to prioritize clamping down on urban sprawl as a means not just of creating greater efficiency for infrastructure and housing and public services and all that, but also from the standpoint of preserving the natural legacy around Columbia and other cities. Because, obviously sprawl is going in areas that are really areas that are highly prioritized and highly valued by people. People want to move toward the beautiful natural areas, but by moving there, that also threatens those very same areas. And one of the questions I had for all of you was, are you looking in any way to prioritize certain areas over others? Because what I'm thinking is that, one of the growth areas in terms of directionally out of Columbia is especially strong toward the south, southwest, and west, which would be toward the Missouri River, toward the Katy Trail, toward Rockbridge Memorial State Park. And while it's understandable that people would want to move closer to these amenities, sprawl toward those amenities would also threaten those amenities. And I'm wondering if this planning process will prioritize not just, if you choose the city density approach, would prioritize not just clamping down on urban sprawl, but also perhaps redirecting it away from the more sensitive natural areas in the county. A lot of the stuff that was discussed here today was fairly high level and didn't get to specifics in terms of direction of growth and stuff like that. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No, sure. No, thanks for the comments, Nick, and thanks for the question. I think, as we move forward again, we've heard, a lot about, the values of some of the places that you mentioned, right? I think we've also want to use, as the folks digest the information tonight, and then, as we have some of the, follow-up, listening sessions later in April, take that and then, you sort of put, pen to paper in terms of, drafting that future land use plan. So, so again, I would anticipate, again, kind of from what we've heard thus far, and again, kind of what we hear from after this effort, this, thing, the continued resonance of those important places of the county, right? So, land use planning is both an art and a science in terms of, you're starting to define those land uses and things, but I would assume that probably one of those goals of, from a policy perspective, would be again some of those things that you mentioned in your question.
Thanks, and I definitely appreciate the high scoring of all of these criteria, except for industry promotion of the city density approach. I'm very thumbs up on that.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Let's see. Anyone else with their hands up? Make sure I haven't double backed on anyone. Last chance for folks to raise their hands. We've hit 9 o'clock. I know it's a late night for me now. So going once, going twice, going 3 times on raised hands. So again, we appreciate everyone. Again, a long webinar, and then staying involved with the questions. A lot of good. Appreciate all the good comments, all the good questions. Again, appreciate you taking the time to learn more about where we are in the process tonight. Appreciate David Boston for, again, the real-time collaboration during the meeting and reaching out. So again, I mentioned the April open houses. Sorry, not open houses, April listening sessions, kind of smaller group discussion. So please sign up and come to one of those if you are able. David mentioned again a series of events next week in terms of housing. If you're interested specifically in that topic, a lot of good chance to be the very beginning on that more detailed discussion. And again, look for this presentation, both the video and the PDF on the website, probably by Friday of this week. And again, if you've registered for this webinar, you'll be on our e-blast list moving forward. So as we move into the next phase of the planning process, you'll be in the know in terms of as things become available. So again, thanks for everyone's time tonight. Thanks again for our planning team. And again, we'll look forward to seeing you and being involved as we move further into this process. All right, thanks everyone.